So I'd like to welcome everybody. Good evening, and thank you very much for joining us this evening for our talk for the Hampstead Psychotherapy Club. I must say, I can't avoid saying how distressed I think I am and so many people are with what's going on in Ukraine. And I think the talk this evening is very apt under the circumstances, because it is horrific. It's a real horror. Mm-hmm. So I don't know how many of you know Robert Romanishin. He is a retired emeritus professor of clinical psychology at Pacific Graduate Institute, and also an affiliate member of the Interregional Society of Jungian Analysts. He is a psychotherapist. He also is an author. He published 8 books, amongst which is The Way of the Heart, Essays Towards an Imaginal Psychology, Technology as Symptom and Dream, Mirror and Metaphor, Images and Stories of Psychological Life, great book. The Wounded Researcher, Research with Soul in Mind. If anybody is doing any research work, this book is a must, an absolute must. It was very, very important for my own research. And then I think the latest one is Victor Frankenstein, The Monster and the Shadows of Technology. The Frankenstein Prophecy is also a great, great book. And this evening, he's going to talk to us about psychotherapy for the end times. So, as I say, I reorganized this talk last year, so had no idea what the circumstances would be, but it's just the right talk for the right time and the right person to give us this talk. So Robert, welcome, and over to you.
Well, first of all, thank you, Claudia, for a very kind introduction and for the invitation, you and Josephine. I'm happy to be here, and greetings to all of you. I'd like to start by pointing out that events have overtaken all of us. And specifically for the talk tonight, I gave this talk, I think it was 3 years ago, for the New Zealand Association of Psychotherapists. And as I say, when I gave it then, it was for a thing they were doing on climate. And that in itself is the paramount issue of our time. But I had to update it because what's going on now has really intensified this experience that I want to speak about tonight of trying to live, love, and work in end times. So let me begin. I want to start by saying that when I first gave this talk, I began with the notion that death is the invisible presence haunting the therapy room, reminding us that the world as we have known it is coming to an end without really knowing what kind of world might follow it. But there's something even behind that notion of death is now the invisible presence. And I just want to say this, not really go into it unless we get questions. I've always had the sense that the practice of psychotherapy that we all engage in is, in part, can be described as the art of dying. Because when you think about it, when psychotherapy works in the sense that it begins to be a transformation for people, it means that old patterns have to die. And that is always the challenge both for the patient and for the therapist, because it is a mortificatio, if I use the language from Jung's stuff on alchemy. It's a dissolution of the things that are familiar to us. And so I've always respected that every patient who crosses the therapy room, and not, you can't go that place with all patients. You've got to respect two things, how far they can go. And I've always made a kind of cardinal rule for myself to never take a patient anywhere where I myself have not already tried to go. But it's always a preparation for dying. So with those two things in mind, the question that frames the talk tonight is, how do we do psychotherapy when an impending sense of an ending is all around us? Now, I've divided my talk tonight into three parts. In the first part, I want to offer a few remarks about how war, COVID, climate crisis are wake-up calls that remind us of something very fundamental that is a kind of archetypal base for me about all these crises that we are experiencing today, whether they be war, whether they be COVID, whether they be climate crisis. Hey, Chris. And that sense, underlying sense, is that we have distanced ourselves so far from the natural world. We have broken that kind of bond between nature, the natural world, and our embodiment, that kind of erotic love affair that exists between us, between the epiphanies of the natural world and our embodied engagement with that. And in breaking that connection, we have made ourselves into spectators behind a window and the world into a spectacle for our use and abuse. And so what I meant in this first part of my presentation, this first remark, is I want to emphasize that if we continue to live as if we are spectators apart from the natural world and not a part of it, if we forget our inherent erotic ties to the natural world, which you can see in almost any child, the way in which the wonders of the world elicit from them, even before language, the pointing finger, as if between the pointing finger and the natural world, there is this kind of bond between the two. And if we forget that and continue to act as if that is the case and forget that we have forgotten it, then we are headed and increase even the sense of end times. So that's the kind of underlying foundation for me. And so what I mean in this first part, when I say that war, COVID, ecological crises are a wake-up call, I mean that I treat them, and we can treat them, war, pandemic, ecological crises, as cultural historical symptoms. If we are able to reimagine the symptom and follow it where it wants to lead us, if we can reimagine the symptom away from any kind of medicalization, which says our task is to cure the symptom, to get away from that and to understand that as a wake-up call, the symptom holds that tension, whatever the symptom may be, trying to ask us to remember something that is too important to forget, but which we forget because it's too painful to remember. So you see that tension for me is always present when I'm going to take off my vest. When I would see a patient, let's say with depression, what I wanted to really focus on is what is that suffering asking them to remember, which has been too vital for their life and has been forgotten. So that's what I mean by dealing with these as a wake-up call. Let's treat them, COVID, war, ecological crises, as symptoms of the soul on a cultural, historical level. Now, in the second part, what I want to propose is that when we are dealing with these crises that herald end times, political, economic, scientific kinds of solutions, as important as they might be, will not change anything unless we have a radical change in human consciousness. And that's where our job comes in. We are change agents in the very act of psychotherapy, in the art of helping people to let go of old patterns that are destructive and repetitive and bind up them in complexes and issues in which they continue to do the same thing over and over again, which we are doing on the cultural historical level. So what we begin to have to do is we have to be agents of change for a new kind of consciousness, which we can midwife in the therapy room. If we can midwife that in the therapy room. And I want to begin by saying that the key part of this work of changing human consciousness, for me, is learning how to grieve. The importance of the mourning, mourning process. A Jungian analyst whose work I highly respect, Greg Mogensen, has written, 20th century humanity has forgotten how to grieve. We're ready to patch things up very quickly. But in my own life experience, in myself, and in my work with patients, the grieving process going down is the way of going deep and coming back out into the recovery of a new way of being. So what I want to do is illustrate how the grieving process can be what I would call a homecoming that heals our broken bonds with the natural world, with each other, and with the larger community of ancestors of which we are a part. Because we cannot forget that the dead are always with us. And in fact, to me, that's one of the unrecognized, perhaps, tragedies of this war. When you think about all those who have died in this century in the wars that we have fought, has their sacrifice been in vain if we keep killing? We keep killing the dead in a way. So I want to suggest that the grieving process can be a homecoming that heals our broken bonds with nature, each other, and the larger community of ancestors of which we are a part. Now, I want to emphasize in this second part, this is really the meat part of my talk. I want to show how the grieving process is a healing process, a homecoming, in several ways. I want to tell the myth. I want to use the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. I don't know how many of you in your practice really find it very helpful sometimes to hear the deeper mythic archetypal resonances in the stories that you hear from your patients. I have always found that and the use of poetry to be helpful. So I want to deal with the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. And then I want to share a little bit of Rainer Maria Rilke's beautiful poem, Orpheus, Eurydice, and Hermes. And then I want to tell a story and show a little clip from a DVD that I made about recovering our broken bonds with the natural world. So I hope that's clear the way I'm laying this out. We'll do that, and then we'll go to the final part of our talk. So this is the essential part. First of all, the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. There are many, many different variations of the myth. I'm drawing on the one that the poet Ovid, Roman poet in the first part of the first century Common Era, in the way that he tells the tale. And in his story, Eurydice is a nymph, a water nymph. And one day as she is with her maidens, dancing and splashing in the pool, this is only one version now, but it's the version that I have focused on in the past. She is seen by Aristaeus, and he's a keeper of the bees, the sacred keeper of the bees. And inflamed with his lust for this beautiful maiden, this nymph. And remember now, myths speak at archetypal levels here, so things might resonate for you deeper than your own personal psyche, I hope. He chases her. And as she is fleeing from him, his pursuit of her, she is bitten by a snake and dies. Now, in a sense, that's a key part of the myth. But already some things jump out at us. It ties together the myth, perhaps, and I've tried to work it in this way, but we'll not do that tonight, to the symptom of colony hive collapse that we know about, the worldwide destruction of bees, who are the major pollinators for all our food. This says something and has something to do with how maybe we could understand that from this mythic point of view, a violation, a crossing of boundaries. Secondly, insofar as she dies, she goes into the underworld. And Orpheus, who has fallen in love with her, is beside himself with grief. Now, Orpheus, to understand that part of the story, Orpheus was given, he's the son of Apollo. He was given the instrument of the lyre, the stringed instrument. And he was so practiced at playing it that all of creation would harmonize and bend to the rhythms of his music. The trees would bend in, the animals would come to listen. So there's something really quite powerful and magical about the singing of Orpheus, the singing of Orpheus. And you know, in a way that it's Orpheus is what we might call the eponymous poet, the poet whose very name is the name of poetry itself. And he mediates between the sacred and the human. So he is bereft, mournful, devastated. And so because of his powerful gifts, he decides to enter the underworld. And his intention is to rescue his beloved and bring her back into life, which itself is a kind of narcissistic, but I don't have time to go into that. That's one way of reading his tale. It'll come out in a different way in further remarks. So playing his lyre, he descends into the underworld, passing the guardians, charming them, and he stands before the god and goddesses of the underworld, Hades and Persephone. He stands before them. Now, you know the myth of Persephone too. Her myth is about the underworld and how her daughter was abducted and has to live in the underworld for 6 months out of the year before she returns. So that too is really important for what we're going to say later about who inhabits, who dwells, who belongs in the underworld. Both myths point to important aspects of that, replies to that question. So he faces Hades and Persephone, and he asks, will you grant me permission to bring Eurydice back to the upper world with me? Now, the one thing about mythology and myths that in almost every myth that you read, it's a humbling, a humiliation of the ego-conscious mind, because they are like dreams in that way, because the gods always have a little trick up their sleeve. And they know that Orpheus is way too proud and way too narcissistically involved and wants Eurydice back because he cannot bear his own grief and sorrow. He wants her back for him. So they say, yes, we grant your wish. You can escort your beloved back into the underworld. So he figures, well, this is very, very easy, very simple. But they say only on one condition. We just lay upon you, Orpheus, one condition, that you not turn around on the journey up to the upper world from the underworld. And proud and vain as he is, he thinks, well, that's no problem for me. So the journey begins. And the journey begins with Orpheus leading the way, Eurydice trailing behind, and the god Hermes, the god Hermes behind it, following behind. Now, every myth or version of the myth that is told does not dispense with him doing the very thing he was told not to do, to turn around. And so there are many interpretations of that. I'm going to emphasize the interpretation that the poet Rainer Maria Rilke gives to it. In his beautiful poem, Orpheus, Eurydice, Hermes. It's a long poem, so I'm not going to read the whole poem. I love reading poetry, but we're not here for a poetry recital. I would love to do that. There's no greater pleasure for me than to read poetry out loud. So I'm just going to describe the scene. In the opening of his poem, he describes the world of the underworld, the world of Dis. There's a poem, later poem by the Roman poet Virgil, where he says, the door to gloomy Dis stands open, but the way back that is the task, to find your way back out of the underworld. And Orpheus is pretty confident he can do that. So Rilke sets the scene. And then after the first two stanzas in this long poem, Orpheus, Eurydice, Hermes, he says, they came along the road. I'll read a few lines. In front, the slender man in the blue cloak. I've got to put on my glasses for this. The slender man in the blue cloak, mute, impatient, looking straight ahead. He ate up the road with his footsteps in big bites, while the harp, a lyre, clung by his side. So in front is Orpheus, racing ahead, confident that he's going to bring back his beloved so that he's not so sorrowful. His mind is like two minds, though. He knows that he should not look back, and he's looking ahead and seeing the lip of the upper world, and so he tries to keep focus on that, but he's not sure. Do I hear them behind me? Are they there? But I cannot turn around because of what the gods said. So he's of two minds, and sometimes it seems to him that all he was hearing was not them following him, but his own steps. But then Rilke goes on and says, they were coming. Only they were two. There were two who moved with terrible stillness. Yeah. Two dim figures walking silently behind the god of journeys, that is Hermes, and secret tidings, shining eyes inside his traveler's hood. Sometimes he's shown with a hood, but penetrating eyes, and wings, slender wings on his feet, and a slender wand. And in his left hand, he holds out to Eurydice. So get the scene. Orpheus running ahead, not sure. Hermes, Eurydice following, and Hermes holding his left hand out as he's guiding her up. And then Rilke says this, and this is important. But she, Eurydice, she walked alone, holding the god's hand. Her footsteps hindered by her long grave clothes, faltering, gentle, and without impatient. She was inside herself and never thought of the man who walked ahead or the road that climbed back toward life. She found herself in a resurrected virginity. Her sex, like a young flower at night, was closed in on itself, and her hands had been in her death so weaned from marriage that she suffered from the light god's endlessly still guiding touch as from too great an intimacy. So I want you to get a sense that in this myth about the grieving process, she is already so deeply into her death in the underworld that even the gentle touch of the god's hand is too much for her to bear. And then he goes on in these lines, Rilke, speaking of Eurydice, or Eurydice. She was no longer the blonde woman who sometimes echoed in the poet's songs. No longer the fragrance, the island of their wide bed, and no longer that man's possession. So already at her death, she's no longer any of that. She was already loosened like long hair and surrendered like the rain, and issued like massive provisions, she was already root. She was already root nature. And this maybe is the most important part where Rilke's poem really touches on the central mystery of this myth. And when all at once the god stopped her, and with pain in his voice spoke the words, or maybe whispered them, he has turned around. She couldn't grasp this and quietly said, who? Who? That is in Rilke's original rendition of the poem. That is the one word that is italicized. She no longer knows who has turned around. But far off in front of the bright door stood someone whose face had grown unrecognizable. He just stood and watched how on this strip of road through the field, the god of secret tidings with a heartbroken expression silently turned to follow Eurydice, already starting back along the same road, footsteps hindered by long grave clothes, faltering, gentle, and without impatience. He's lost her for the second time. First, in her death by the snake bite, and now, because the gods know two things. One, that his attempt to bring her back, to resurrect her back into life, was for his own benefit. So the gods know that he has to learn something. Something of his narcissism has to be transformed. But secondly, the fact that she goes back into the underworld raises for us right now in this moment, with its bearing on the symptomatic expression of war, COVID, the pandemic, all of that. Two things. One, is the feminine, in the sense that Jung uses it, the soul, the deeper wisdom of soul, is that where it lives, in the dark light of the underworld? Is that one thing that the myth is telling us? That the rightful place of Eurydice as an icon or a symbol of the feminine, of the soul, the rightful place is in the underworld. The deep wisdom of psyche that bubbles up from what we call unconscious dynamics or depths. And the second aspect is, while that is archetypally and mythically perhaps one of the central meanings of the myth, she is where she, the soul, the psyche, its deeper wisdom is exactly where it belongs, in the dark light of the underworld. But the second meaning is that in our culture today, with the rise of science and technology and splitting off from nature, in the work that I did earlier with the technology book, and then rewrote now with the Frankenstein book, you could look at the origins of modern science and technology as a way of splitting off from the spectator mind and its masculine expressions. It's penetrating into nature and nature as feminine. And we have abused nature to the point where now nature as feminine is suffering even in the world today. So it belongs in the underworld. We've brought it back up. We've made it an object for our use and abuse. And that only doubles down on a key issue that the myth tells us, and about the grieving process, is how do we recover the marriage of the feminine soul and the masculine mind? How do we affect that tension of opposites and hold together? Another version of that would be spirit and matter. How do we keep together that mystery of alchemy of the masculine and the feminine, of spirit and matter? So the myth, the poem are examples of the grieving process and some of the lessons that it is trying to teach us, that it can be a homecoming by first letting go of what we want to possess. The grieving process is a process of losing what we would dominate and possess. Either it's taken away from us. Well, most of the time, that's what happens. It's rare to voluntarily give that up. Love, loss, death, and transformation. Those are the steps in the grieving process. And that's what the myth and the poem illustrates. Now, how do we apply that to where we are today? Well, what are we losing? What are the old patterns? Go back to the first part. Our attitude of nature has to change. And that means we have to let go of the idea that we are the dominant species. We have to let go of the idea that we are not interconnected with everything. We have to let go of the idea we have to die to it and be transformed by letting go of that we do not so much impose on the meaning of nature. We are responsive to what it asks of us in this kind of dialogue. Again, I go back to Rilke in the Duino Elegies. He says, earth, nature, matter, feminine spirit, isn't this what you want? An invisible resurrection in us? Are we not here for saying, house, tree, jug, fountain, pillar, Pillar, oh, but for the saying the things themselves could not hope to be. What he's pointing out there is that instead of seeing ourselves from the ego-conscious point of view as the ones who give meaning to nature, we have to allow ourselves to be addressed by what nature wants from us. Earth, isn't this what you want? That doesn't mean we're passive. The opposite of being active and domineering and controlling is not passivity. It's receptivity, which means then that the art of attending to the crises that we face today begins in the ear. What are they asking of us? Not in the clever mind. What should we do? How should we fix it? What is this something asking us to remember that we have forgotten? And I've talked about that attitude. We have to find a way to be humiliated, like a dream is a nightly humiliation of the ego-conscious mind, in the sense of the root of humiliation is in the word humus, earth, soil. So we have to be brought back down to that earthiness that we are, from here to here, and in between. Again, Rilke's poetry, the matter of the heart. He says in one of his poems, the time of the eye is done. Now it is time for the heart which registers right here in the center between the active mind and the chakras that are below us. The heart, speaking through the heart, coming to know through the heart. The heart has its reasons, Pascal said, which reason does not know. So the healing power in this second part has to be midwife through the grieving process. How do we practice that art in psychotherapy? It's again by helping those who cross the threshold in the very process of what therapy is about, dying to old patterns, letting go of repetitions, finding the speck in your own eye. You know, when I would teach my graduate students, and I love doing consultation, I reminded them that Rilke said, love is the most difficult work of all, apart from which everything else you do in life is but a preparation. And I would use the example of how we project onto the other the needs that we cannot admit to ourselves. and real challenge of learning how to love is, if I use technical language, withdraw the projection, but that's not satisfying enough for me. The real task in learning how to love is to see through what we impose on the other, be this, be that for me, and stand in that moment. And when this can happen, it is an epiphany of wonder. And suddenly you see the other, perhaps for the first time, in the mystery of their being. I mean, that's a rare thing to happen. But sometimes that also happens in therapy. And that's what I think I'm aiming for now, that if we can move what's happening on using the individual psychotherapy as an analogy and look to applying it to the cultural historical perspective, maybe then we could find a way to deal psychologically, archetypally, mythically, with the crisis we are facing. So I've tried to give two examples about the grieving process as a process of love, loss, descent, and transformation, and as such a healing process. And now I want to illustrate how that transformation of consciousness, where we suddenly then recover how we are a part of nature and not apart from it, happened for me when in 2009, I took a journey to the Antarctic. And it was a spiritual transformation. And one quick story I should tell about that. You know, I had dreamed about the Antarctic 30 years earlier. And then a friend of mine came back and I had forgotten the dream, but the dream hadn't forgotten me. And so I knew I wanted to go. And I said to my wife, you know, I have to go there. And she said, fine, okay. And I said, it costs a lot of money. And when we figured it out, it was like $25,000. And I was just ready to get my Social Security. And I went to the office and the lady called me into the office. And she said, we owe you some back pay. I said, fine. I thought maybe $500. And I said, how much? She said, $24,500. And I fell on my knees and I said, can you make it 500 more? But it was a synchronicity, the inner and the outer. Something that was calling me then found its expression in the outer world, this gift. So if we could share this, it's a 1.5-minute link, which shows the transformation that this landscape, this spiritual landscape had on me. So can we put up that DVD?
Sure, sure. Can you see it?
Yes.
Good.
The Antarctic has been as much a presence in our collective imagination as it has been a place on the map. No surprise then that for Ernest Shackleton, one of the earliest explorers of the remote southern regions of the world, the journey began with a dream. For me too, the journey began with a dream of more than 30 years ago. Ice bewitches the human soul, and its spells weave many dreams. An ancient intelligence was this world. The intelligence that long ago was called the anima mundi, the soul of the world. It's the mind of nature, deeper than our rational minds. We are strangers here, strange from ourselves, in this land where a continent lies beneath snows that have fallen for thousands of years, orphans in time, in a land of ice that seems timeless. The music didn't come through and it was a bit scratchy, so I apologize for that. It was too much of an echo, but maybe that last image, the music, I put that together when I came back. I took 500 photographs and I selected 36 of them and worked with a man who writes scores for films, and he put together the music. You can go on my website and robertromanishin.com, and you can play that clip and you'll get the full meaning, the full sense of it. And then I added the voiceover. But stay with that last image. That was the last image before we were leaving. You know, and we went down on this Norwegian vessel, and fantastic journey to go through the ice, even when you got stuck. And at one point we were stuck, and then he said we couldn't go through. And when the ice cracks, it's unlike a sound I've ever heard before. It's like an ancient sound of nature when that ice begins to crack beneath the hull of your ship. And so you go down and then you get on these little rubber dinghies and you go on, you make landings. Well, you were supposed to go on only one. Veronica and I went on every single one. We were down there for about 5 days. And I remember there were some people, I said, aren't you going again? They said, no, you're on it once. You've seen it all. Ice is ice. And you ride these rubber dinghies and you get on the ice, and we climbed that hill, one of those images, and that beautiful frozen lake. But when we were leaving, I turned around and I saw that blue ice. And blue is the color of ice when all of the air bubbles have been squeezed into it. And I said to the young man who was driving, I said, I want to get on that. He said, no, you can't do that. You can't stand on that float. But he said, I'll take you there. And I took many pictures of it. When I came back, I looked at it. And I've showed it many times. To me, it always looked like a heart with the aorta going up. And I began to imagine that beneath the melting polar ice is an awakening heart that we have to awaken in ourselves in order to get back and grieve what we have done to nature. That's one way of looking at it. But somebody else, a midwife, said to me, no, it's also a womb, heart and womb. They have similar resonances, a new birth. But the melting polar ice might be then a way in which we are being asked to, again, change our attitudes and open our hearts to what we have done so that a new birth of our attitude can begin. So, mindful of the time here, I want to tell a story about illustrating the grieving process. And that illustrates how we have isolated ourselves from nature. But first, before I do that, I just want to share a very small poem that Rilke wrote in 1913. Because when I found this poem in preparation for tonight, I realized that it accurately describes the healing ritual I do every day that was taught to me by a shaman. Every morning and every evening, I do this. I do it sometimes specifically for someone who is asked, who is suffering. But lately I have been doing it for all of the people who are suffering the consequences of this terrible war. And this poem, which really brings the energies from the heavens down through you and the earth and gives it back out. So you become a kind of resonator for putting together sky and earth, spirit and matter, through you. And this is the poem, which when I found it, I said, oh my God, this is just like this ritual. So he wrote this poem in 1913. Overflowing heavens of squandered stars flame brilliantly above your troubles. Instead of into your pillows, weep up towards them. There at the already weeping, at the ending visage, slowly thinning out, ravishing world space begins. Breathe. Breathe the darkness of the earth again. Look up again. Lightly and facelessly, depths lean toward you. Depths lean toward you from above. The serene countenance dissolved in night makes room for your serenity. That reconnects us in ways that if you regard, if you look up and breathe the sky back into you, its vast serenity applies to you. And now, story about the grieving process, and then I will end the third part. Some of you might know this story, but it's one of two or three that I could use that expresses for me the miracle of a moment when you realize how far away from home we have been in that broken connection with the natural world, which has seeded all of our difficulties. Part one of the talk. So here's the story. One day, maybe 20 years ago, maybe a little bit more, on a visit to my parents, living in Texas at that time, in New York. The grandchildren were with their grandparents, and my wife was okay with it. I would kind of drift in the city. I like drifting. One day I found myself outside the Central Park Zoo. And I went in, and it was a winter day, and I was dressed in a heavy coat, a kind of cap over my ears, and it was empty. And I went into the ape house. It was empty. So I walked to the end of the corridor, and they're sitting with its profile to me. So if I am one of you, the gorilla was sitting like this. And I know from experience of being in the wild with different animals that gorillas are incredibly shy and do not like to be looked at or stared at. So every once in a while, he would turn his head and look at me and turn away. I had in my pocket an orange, and I took it out of my pocket, and absentmindedly, I was playing with it, throwing it up, and that caught his attention. Now, this is amazing. The space between us was no more than, I should use meters, I guess, but I think in feet still, so maybe 3.5 feet, 4 feet. And without thinking about it, I tossed the orange to the gorilla. He caught it. Now, you would imagine, it's easy to imagine that an animal offered food like that would take it to the corner and eat it. He didn't do that. He tossed it back to me. He tossed it to me. I tossed it to him. He tossed it to me. I tossed it to him. I tossed it to him. It was on the third toss that the super ego of the zoo came in, the zookeeper, and said, "Don't feed the animals." It broke the ribbon of the game that had crossed species and that had made a connection that made me feel part of all of creation. And of course, he took it with that and went, and it was broken. And I remember I walked out and I saw the skyline of Manhattan And this is what I wrote. I felt I left the gorilla inside, but I meant that in literal sense. He's in there, but I had caged up my own animal nature, and we are suffering, and I have been suffering from that. So that story is one that I think says what I want to say. Now I end part 3. I've been thinking a lot about how do we in end times respond to these crises? What is a psychological perspective that we might be able to bring? A mythic, archetypal context, a psychological perspective that makes a place for complexes and unconscious dynamics into this war, into this terrible, destructive war. And this is what I wrote in my journal, and I'll end with this. As the planet is in crises from global warming, Putin's mythic quest to restore Mother Russia to its original and former greatness is a replay of Hitler's mythic quest to restore the German fatherland to its original greatness. Both of them, from a psychological point of view, are acting out a mother story, an origin story. Oh, well, not a mother story, but an origin story. And because it is acted out, you know, they talk about it, but if they're being lived by this unconscious archetypal dynamic of origins, you know, we all tell origin story, and it's to get back to the mother, to the father, to the parents, the fatherland, the motherland, German fatherland, the motherland. Both of them are doing that because I'm a reader of history, and Brendan Sims' book, Hitler, A Global Biography, has been my source for this. And I think at the same time, it's a virus, this origin stories to return to some Eden, to some greatness that once was and we have lost. Think of America, MAGA, Make America Great Again. That's a mythic fantasy. And yet look how that is also causing so many problems. The mythic, psychological, archetypal background of both origin stories, or include MAGA, Make America Great Again, are the unconscious motive forces that are driving these wars. Hitler began to annex Austria and invaded Czechoslovakia. Putin, with the invasion of the Ukraine, is playing the same thing. Hitler wanted to get living space and invade Russia through Poland. What is Putin doing? He wants to stop NATO increasing. So it's like we're replaying the same thing. What does that strike you as? The origin story is being replayed as a repetition compulsion. That's the hardest thing to break in therapy. So that's what I prepared. I hope that makes some sense. I have to tell you, and I have to confess, saying it cannot capture the depth of the sorrow that I feel about. I don't know if saying any of this, I don't know if we can stop any of this, but all I know is what I can do to continue to do my work, to continue to write, to continue to practice love and gratitude, and to send out in those ritual ceremonies that I do a hope for joy, for peace, and the gratitude that I feel for being given this chance. Thank you all very much.